Welcome to the Starlight Lounge at Las Vegas.
Ja, hej allesammans. Det är då, vi ska hålla en intervju och sen signering med författaren Dan Abnett som är framstående författare hos Black Library till exempel. Skrivit mycket romaner angående i Warhammer 40 000 universumet. Han gör ju också mycket annat då, som vi har många svarare här idag så. Men I don't really know what to start, but let's see. Well, let's start with what inspires you to write.
What inspires me to write?
It's off.
It's off.
Yeah.
On now? Oh, good. What inspires me to write? On a daily basis, all sorts of things. Nothing specifically. I read an awful lot, and if I don't read, I can't write. So it can be newspapers or magazines or non-fiction or fiction or whatever. But unless I put words in, nothing comes out. It's like putting fuel into a car. And if I'm ever really stuck for ideas, I get on a train. Don't know why. Just being on a train gives me ideas. Just watching the world go by outside the window. So yes, yes. What inspires me to write originally was an enormous enthusiasm for stories and the reading that I did when I was very young. So, yeah.
Do you have any favorite authors? Or?
Many favourite authors, but probably my all-time favourite author is Ray Bradbury, and I also like Jack Vance. Grew up reading Lovecraft and Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard and that kind of stuff. So in the genre, all the sort of classic things you can imagine. These days, I like all sorts of odd things. I don't read as much science fiction now. I think because I do it all day. So I escape into, I don't know, detective fiction or something else when I'm reading for pleasure. But I really like. Probably my favourite modern author is American author of short stories called Kelly Link. I don't know if you've ever read any of her stuff, but she's very, very good indeed.
You've been writing comics as well since late in the 80s.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Do you have any favorite superheroes or anything?
Oh yeah, no. I started writing comics as essentially the beginning of my career. When I was a kid, I used to like drawing pictures and writing stories. And when I sort of discovered comics when I was quite young, I realised I could do both of those things at the same time and write my own comics. And ended up working for Marvel out of university editorially, and they encouraged you to write stories as an editor so that you could better understand how storytelling works, so that you could then edit freelance writers. So my original first paying gigs as a writer was on things like Care Bears and G.I. Joe and Transformers and Thundercats and Thomas the Tank Engine and all sorts of things like that, sort of licensed products which taught me how to use to work within the framework of essentially of somebody else's universe. There's a difference in scale, but ultimately there's no difference between working in the universe of Thomas the Tank Engine and working in the universe of Warhammer. There's still a universe with its own rules, and you've got to respect the content of it. So yeah, comics. I basically went freelance as a comic writer when I discovered I like writing them more than editing them, and I've written so many different characters. It was a huge thrill to write things like Batman and Iron Man and the Avengers and characters that I grew up reading. I think I'm biased slightly towards Marvel rather than DC.
And speaking of Warhammer and such, how did you come into contact with Black Library and started writing for them?
I'd always wanted to write long-form fiction, prose fiction, as well as comics. Even today I still write comics. In fact, I split my day between writing novels and writing comics. It's almost one in the afternoon and one in the morning. But I've been writing comics for about 10 years, and I've written several issues of Conan for Marvel, and I was approached by Black Library, which had just been set up to publish originally comics and then short stories and novels for the Warhammer universe, Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000, so both. And somebody had recommended me on the basis of the fact that obviously if I wrote Conan, I understood how a sword worked. So they gave me they interviewed me. But in the early 80s, before I'd started writing, I was a very keen role-playing gamer, Dungeons and Dragons, Traveller, Call of Cthulhu, things like that. So I was very aware. Games Workshop was the company that imported these games into the UK, and did their British editions of them. And they published a magazine called White Dwarf, which I read every month when it was about more than just Warhammer. So I was very familiar with Games Workshop as a company. So although I hadn't actually played Warhammer, I understood the universe, I understood the way it looked and felt because I was familiar with their sort of art style, John Blanche's art style, this kind of stuff. So the trick was that I got the atmosphere of it pretty quickly. Once I'd written some comics, they said, will you write some short stories? And I said, yeah, great, love to do that. And they said, well, actually, do you fancy writing some novels? And that was the fateful moment where somebody was actually commissioning me to write a novel. And that's really where it started, which was about 16, 17 years ago. And a ridiculous number of novels later. I still enjoy doing it.
You started playing the games? Or?
Oh yes, no, I have played every version of everything they've done at least once, so I understand how it works. And I come from a town called Maidstone in Kent, in the south of England, and we have both a branch of Games Workshop and an independent game store. And they both will often set up games for me to play, so I can try things out. So I can actually either remind myself how the game feels to play, which is useful for when you're writing it, or actually I specifically set up scenarios to see if something I've put in a book will work within the game terms, sometimes with hilarious results. So that's yeah. I try. I don't play as much as I'd like to because otherwise I'd never get any writing done. But yeah, I do play that.
Do you do any research? Or that just seeing as you write very military genre and such, and set in Warhammer universes and etc. How much research?
I do a huge amount of research actually. I'm reading all the time, and I like reading a lot of non-fiction. The greatest compliment I've been paid. I've been paid it several times at Games Days is when people have come in and said, soldiers have come in and said, "Are you a veteran?" Because they recognise something going on there, and it's simply I research very, very carefully, and I find that not just in terms of the military stuff, but in terms of almost anything that I'm writing, I think really, really good SF and fantasy works if it's got a degree of authenticity to it. So I will always research the closest real-world thing like what I'm writing about. So I find the real-world analogue to what I'm writing about. An example would be I wrote a book called Titanicus, which is about the Titan war machines in the Warhammer universe, which are enormous walking things with crews inside them. Now, obviously, they don't exist in the real world, but what I researched was submarine warfare, because that to me was about being in a metal container where you're a crew and the claustrophobia and all that kind of stuff. It was the closest thing I could find to Titans. So I researched that and then wrote the Titans, bearing in mind that kind of stuff that I found out there, and that to me gave them a very realistic feel and made them feel like real machines. So that's a trick I try to use. I try and find the closest thing in the real world and then translate it sideways into whatever I'm doing.
Yeah, I was wondering as well. You started writing a long time ago, and you've written tons of stories about tons of characters. And where do the ideas for the actual characters come from? Do you have any favorites among them? I
do have. Yeah, I'm very fond of characters. I'm notorious for killing characters off, and which to the great horror of people, which I do because it's an authenticity thing as well. Most of these stories about war, and if characters don't die, there's something fundamentally unrealistic about it. But some characters are based on people I know. Some characters are based on combinations of people I know. Some characters are based on, I sort of cast them in my head as if it's a movie. So some of the characters are sort of movie actors, and I think of them. And some characters just create themselves and intrude upon the story, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they sort of take on a personality all of their own, which has happened on several occasions. Yeah. But sometimes sometimes it comes as a terrible shock to me that I've killed the character off. I get very sad about it because I don't necessarily want to lose them either. I can understand the outrage that has been expressed to me on occasions about how could you kill off that character, and I'm not quite sure how I could do it. It's not malicious on my part. I care about them a lot as well. So yes, to lose one of them is tremendously painful. Do I have any favourites? Many actually. Yeah, probably too many to mention.
Yeah, as you've been writing for a while as well, how do you feel you've developed as an author? I recall you writing in the forward to the founding omnibus that you were, at the time you wrote it, you weren't comfortable with writing about Space Marines and such, and you've grown to do that as well. Yeah. How do you feel you have grown to do such things?
There are technical changes in what I do because that's a good one. When I started writing for for Black Library, I didn't feel confident about writing Space Marines because I didn't think I could portray something so impersonal and non-human very effectively as the main protagonist, which is why I started with the Imperial Guard, because they were regular, or as close to regular human as you could get. So there are things I now have much more greater. I mean, writing the Horus Heresy, we're dealing not only with Space Marines, we're dealing with Primarchs, we're dealing with all sorts of extraordinary beings, and I feel much more confident about writing those. But I think just as a writer, when I've written nearly 50 books, and that kind of makes things. Just your style evolves. I'm more confident about taking on different styles specifically for a particular book, sort of the tone of a certain thing, and more confident about. Well, if you compare the most recent Gaunt's Ghost book, which is called Salvation's Reach, which is the 13th in the series, if you compare that to the very first one, it's a much more complicated plot. I've got many characters moving around each other, all sorts of things connecting up. There is the vast weight of continuity in the series and all this kind of stuff. I would never ever have had the confidence to do that when I started, because I would have felt afraid that I would get lost. Whereas now I sit down, but then again, you can take on things that are too ambitious. The book I'm currently writing is another Horus Heresy novel. It's called The Unremembered Empire, and it's the most complicated novel I've ever written. Mainly because I'm not only dealing with my own continuity, I'm dealing with the continuity of 6 or 7 other authors, and it's a sort of mind-blowing experience trying to keep up with it. But I wouldn't have done that even 5 years ago. I wouldn't have tried to do that. So I guess you get more confident and you get sort of more ambitious, and sometimes you do. The stylistic thing. I remember when I wrote, it's Eisenhorn here, like this one. I'd never written a book in the first person before, and I went, that'll be fun to do, and it isn't. But once I decided I was going to write in the first person, I was kind of stuck. So much harder to do. My last Horus Heresy novel, No Fear, I wanted it to be a really immediate, exciting book, so I decided to write it all in the present tense. So everything is happening right now, rather than was happening. And again, that's very effective. People really like that. It was exhausting to write it, because usually when you're writing a book, you can go in the past tense. You can stop at the end of the day and you can come back to it the following day. But with the present tense, it's all going on in my head all the time for 3 months, which just wore me out.
Yeah, you mentioned one ongoing project right now, Unremembered Empire. What else does the future hold in store?
In quick succession, I write the next Gaunt's Ghost novel, which is called The Warmaster, which will be out for Christmas, and will come out alongside a book that my wife and I are collaborating on, which is a Space Marines Battles book, which will be set on the same planet at the same time as the Gaunt book, on the other side of the planet. So there's simultaneous books about the same war zone. So the Iron Snakes characters in Salvation's Reach sort of move across into this Space Marines Battles book, and it becomes an Iron Snakes, and also the characters from Titanicus turn up, and so huge. So that actually spreading this enormous action across 2 books is quite a fun thing to do. And then there's another Horus Heresy book to be decided exactly which one it is, because we've got to have a big summit to work out where the next bit of the story goes. So there's several options there. And then I write the next book in the Beckwin, the Inquisitor series. Pariah was the first one, came out last year, so it'll be the next one of those, which is quite fun because it's a very different pace to stuff. And yes, and I'm writing one of my own original fiction, non-Warhammer things, a thing called Monster Side, which will be out from Angry Robot early next year, which is it's about killing monsters, really, on a very big scale. But yeah, I've been looking forward to writing that too. So yeah, lots and lots of things, and comics all the while, loads and loads of comics.
Well, yeah, I can't wait. But I think we'll wrap it up around there.
Får vi ställa några frågor?
Yeah, do we have any questions?
I have a couple of questions, if it's all right.
Yes.
Yeah, anyone has a question, so you should go up here so you can get a mic.
I saw you wrote a book about Doctor Who.
Yes.
How did that happen?
I was invited to write it. I was very, very pleased to do that. When I was working on staff at Marvel, back in the very start of my career, they were the publisher of Doctor Who magazine. And in fact, I'd written, like I said, Care Bears and Thundercats and Ghostbusters, all these things. And when I was invited to write the Doctor Who comic strip for Doctor Who magazine, I really felt that I'd made it, because it was a really important thing to do. I loved Doctor Who from years ago. So I wrote quite a few comic strips back then. and that led in the 90s to me being invited. The guy called Gary Russell, who was one of the producing people on the TV show, he worked for Big Finish. So I was invited to. He remembered my comic strips and liked them, and he invited me to write for the Big Finish audio. So I did 2 audio dramas for Sylvester McCoy's Doctor, which was very fun to do. And then when Doctor Who came back, I wrote a book called The Book of Martha, which ties into the David Tennant run. I wrote several original audios, and I was then hired to write one of the very first Torchwood novels. So I wrote that, it's called Border Princes, and actually I wrote it before I'd ever seen it. There was no episodes to see because they were still making them. So I got to visit the set, but I got to read the script. But it was a very scary experience to write something and think, I hope I've got this right, because when this television series comes out, it'll be too late. But yeah, it fitted, and that pleased them enough that they asked me to write the Silent Stars Go By, which is a Matt Smith adventure for Christmas last year. That was the Christmas Doctor Who book. And this year, because it's the 50th anniversary, they've republished 11 classic novels, one for each Doctor, and mine was chosen to represent the Matt Smith one. So it's a lovely addition with mine's the recent one, the 11th one. Great fun to write that, particularly because you get to visit the TARDIS and push buttons and do stuff and get a tour.
I think we're all jealous of that.
I'm jealous of me for that.
Do you have a favourite Doctor?
Yes. My favourite Doctor actually is John Pertwee, the 3rd one, because he was the Doctor who was the Doctor when I started watching it. Yes, just very, very fond of that, and I think back very fondly. But I think modern Doctor Who is very, very fast-paced, very, very funny, and very entertaining. And I particularly like David Tennant. And to write for David Tennant, he read one of my audios. That was a real treat to hear him deal with it.
You've written so many different universes and so many different. Do you feel like you've maybe had some influence in how people see these universes, like the Black Library, or even Doctor Who?
I hope so. Yeah, I mean there is a trick to when you're writing in somebody else's universe. The real trick is you've essentially got to put the toys back in the box when you've finished. You can't break or change things because it's somebody else's universe. So you're hired on to do something. And the trick for me is to try and do a story that doesn't look like that's what I'm doing. To do something that actually seems to advance things without damage. So you feel that there's a worthwhile story to be told rather than just taking the toys out, playing with them, and putting them back in. But for some of the universes, Warhammer in particular, really there was very little fiction written for Warhammer when I came along. Although it was 10 years old, and it was at that time felt like a very established universe. There was so little done. When I started writing, I realised that there weren't common words for everyday objects because in the game you didn't need to know that, but when you're writing a book you need to know what these things are called. So I would invent words for things like for the radios I called them voxcasters, and for the PDAs they got I called them data slates and this kind of stuff. The stuff they put in their flamethrowers I called it Promethean. I just invented words, and now if you get a rule book, that's what they're called. So I have even though it's not my universe, I've shaped it there because the basic vocabulary I think an awful lot of it has come from my work, which is great. And when it's a more established universe, when I've written for Star Trek, the Star Trek comic, or written for Doctor Who, you can make less of a mark because it isn't fluid and open to that sort of contribution. But I do think it's significant that in one of my audios, I made the joke about somebody said he said I'm the Doctor, and somebody said Doctor Who. Question mark. And at the time, Gary Russell thought that was extremely funny. He said, "I can't believe no one's ever made that joke before." And I think it's interesting now that the TV show is all about what's his name. So I don't know whether I'm not taking credit for that really, but I may have been the first one to ask the question. Oh yes, then the White Rabbit. Yeah, in one of the audios, Doctor Who audios, I mentioned a pub called the White Rabbit, and I mentioned the pub called the White Rabbit because there is a pub at the corner of my street called the White Rabbit, and I didn't know, but it has now become a running gag in all the audios. Everybody puts the White Rabbit pub in, no matter where they are. There is a pub called the White Rabbit, as if the White Rabbit pub moves through time and space after the Doctor. So if there is a pub scene in one of the stories, that's what it's called. Little do they know, I know the real one. I didn't make it up. It's a real place.
And maybe it's a silly question, but you mentioned Lovecraft.
Yes.
Have you made any references to Lovecraft in your books, or
Yeah.
maybe used a bit of his universe?
Yeah, as I said, Lovecraft was one of the people I read really, really enthusiastically. As quite young, actually, made a huge impact. I don't know what it is about Lovecraft, but more than anybody else, he seems to make that impact on almost everywhere. He's the only sort of cross-genre author I can think of. Lovecraft seeps into science fiction, fantasy, horror, everywhere. It's as if he's the defining base mythology of the entire genre, and it's not inappropriate to put him into almost anything. So I make reference. Everyone does it. Everyone does it all the time. So I make references. So for instance, I think the last time I did it, there is a mention of the King in Yellow in Pariah. So there's Lovecraftian touches in the Inquisitor books, and sometimes actually I have to pull myself back from doing it too much because I don't want to make it too obvious. When I was writing Guardians of the Galaxy comic for Marvel, that culminated in a huge mini-series called The Thanos Imperative, where they were essentially fighting Lovecraftian Cthulhuid monsters from another dimension, all but the name. We didn't go as far as to call them, but they were called. I think we referred to them as the old ones at one point. But that was the idea. They'd opened up a dimension. Everybody went, "Oh my God! It's the Guardians of the Galaxy fighting Lovecraft monsters." And, and the only thing I wasn't allowed to say is actually call them that. But yeah. So yes, they crop up all over the place, and people tend to be because people recognise it. Fans of the genre just recognise that little hint of Lovecraft. It's like, I don't know. It's like a flavouring. And sometimes it somehow imparts that sense of true cosmic horror, which nothing else seems to be able to do in quite the same way.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Är det någon annan som vill ställa en fråga? Vi börjar med dig då. Den är lite kort, den här slagen.
Speaking of the Guardians of the Galaxy, you stepped into those shoes after Keith Giffen basically built up that entire thing from scratch. But the movie is going to be pretty heavily inspired by your run.
Yes.
So how does that feel, being the inspiration for a major Hollywood movie?
It's great. It's great. You'd think that would make me incredibly rich, but unfortunately, it was work for hire. No, it's great. Keith had set up the sort of restarted an interest in cosmic superheroes with Annihilation, and I came in and wrote the Nova thing first of all. And Nova was so successful it turned into an ongoing series, and they wanted a team book. And although he'd written about Star-Lord and the other characters, I was the one who suggested that we rebranded those characters as the Guardians of the Galaxy, which of course was a different team. So that's what the film is about. It is Star-Lord and Rocket Raccoon and Groot and Drax and Gamora in the team. So it is, and I actually have been to the set. And I've seen the designs and I've read the script, and I can't tell you anything about it because I also had to sign an NDA. But it is going to be terrific. It's not a literal version of the story from my run, but it is absolutely seeped in the feeling of that. And if you like those comics, I think the film will absolutely delight you, because there were things that were making me quite excited when I was reading it. I can't believe they put this in. So it's great, and they're beautifully designed as well.
I read somewhere that Cosmo is probably going to be in there somewhere as well, or
I would hope so.
At least as a reference or as a background shot. So that's kind of cool, because it's like kind of your creation.
I was going to say yes. If any character turns up, it would be great if it was Cosmo, because then I will get some money, because I actually did invent it.
Well, there you go. Yes.
Hi.
So you mentioned there was all this in the Warhammer universe. You were having to consider a lot of information and different authors and so on. So it's just sort of like a special technique to keep all these things in the correct order, or do you have like a whiteboard where you put events, or I mean, how do you manage?
It happens at different levels. I always carry notebooks, and when I'm writing a project, it gets its own notebook, which gets filled with stuff, and keeping track of the plot of a novel. I actually use post-it notes. I put plot points on post-it notes, cover my desk with them, so I can move them around and slowly screw them all up, tear them off and screw them up when I've used them up. In terms of something like the Horus Heresy, which has got its own vast continuity, we have 2 or 3 guys at head office who take minutes in our meetings. We have regular summit meetings where all the authors come together. We do have a whiteboard with all sorts of crazy things written on it. But the minutes are huge. We have this ongoing sort of working document. We've got a timeline. We've got... The complexity is astonishing, and really quite often it's a case of me sending an email or picking up the phone and sending the guy called Laurie, particularly, who's the continuity guru, and saying, please help me, what is the answer to this question? How many Dark Angels were there on McCrack at this point? Did the Lion know this when Rebecca Gilliman knew that? And that, because it gets very, very complicated, because the books obviously they don't necessarily fit end to end. Some of them are happening simultaneously, and some of them flash back to the past, and it's quite difficult to keep up with that. And we do try our absolute level best not to make a mistake, and if we do make a mistake, we try and rectify it as quickly as possible. But and if you made a mistake that you can't rectify, you blame it on the warp. If the warp did it, that's the unreliable part of the Warhammer universe. But it is terribly complicated, and that's why the novel I'm writing at the moment here sort of hurts a lot.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Another question?
Thank
Thank you. I'm wondering in the Gaunt books.
Yes.
How long is the timeline there from the planet exploded to where they are now? Because I'm trying to find how long it has been. Because I think in the latest book he has a son now.
Well, yes, indeed. It's roughly speaking a year a book. Roughly speaking, but there's sort of a year between each story, and some of them. So I think if I'm doing my homework correctly, in the introduction to each one, there's a kind of little quote for the history of the later Imperial Crusades. There's a bit that sets up each book, and I think the date is carried through that. So through all of them. So and I did a companion book, which is very hard to find nowadays, but it's the Savage Worlds Crusade book, which covers the timeline from the start of the crusade to when things happen. And I think the son has had. I think the son is older than he appears to be because of the accelerated
warp.
But yeah, process. The warp, yeah.
Every time there is a continuity issue in the Warhammer 40k universe, you only have the the warp did it.
Yeah, absolutely, always the warp. No, actually, but when I make an error in my books, and I do make errors in my book, particularly when you've written the Gaunt's Ghost series, 14 books into it, and that's nearly 1.5 million words. There's an awful lot of room for making terrible mistakes in there. And when I notice one, I instead of pretending it hasn't happened, I turn it into a plot point. I make a point of fixing it, and quite often characters have become quite important because they were a minor character. I made a tiny mistake with them. I've noticed it, and in rectifying it, I've made the character more important. So actually, several of my major characters have come out of mistakes, which I think is a very positive way of dealing with your own continuity errors. I made a continuity error in the 3rd book in the series, which I'm about to fix in the 14th, and it will determine the plot line of the entire novel.
And a final question: when will the next one in the Pariah series came out?
The Pariah, yeah. Penitent is the next one, and that will be out next year. I'm basically having to alternate that with the Gaunt book, and then because there's a Horus book, and in between each Horus book, there's either a Gaunt book or a.
So you have 3 series you have to keep juggling about.
Yeah, yes, and others besides, because I keep promising to do things like write a sequel to the air combat book Double Eagle, which I've been trying to do that for about 6 years now, and I just can't find a slot to write it in.
Yes, and one more final question.
Yes, always good to have one more final question.
Yes, there was you wrote the script for the Warhammer 40k University film.
I did, yes.
Will there be another film in the
I don't know. That was a sort of an experiment to see what we could do, and they were very limited. I think they did extraordinarily well. They were very limited by their budget, and I think nowadays that they would only attempt to do it if they could get a much. When I say they, I mean Games Workshop would only attempt to do it if they could get a much bigger budget, because the universe is so big and it needs the impact of it. We were severely sort of restrained by certain things, although it was very fun to do. You can imagine sitting there. I got to go visit the Abbey Road studio when they were doing the voice recordings. I watched John Hurt and Terence Stamp recording their dialogue, and that was a real treat.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Well, just a quick one. You mentioned writing in other people's frames, and considering the Games Workshop books, do they micromanage a lot, or is it just do you get free hands pretty much?
It depends which bit I'm working on, actually. When I'm writing Gaunt's Ghosts or the Inquisitor books, which are essentially my corner of the universe, they don't. In fact, they nickname it the Dannyverse, which is the little corner of the Warhammer universe that I sort of built and I mapped out and all that kind of stuff. So I have a much freer range on that, but they really do keep a careful eye on the Horus Heresy, mainly because it's their premier imprint. It's the mythology of their universe, and we've got to get it right. And it's also got to be managed between multiple authors, so the necessity to keep track of that. So there's a great deal more feedback and micromanagement on that than other things I do for them.
I really like the Eisenhorn novels, and because it shows a part of the Games Workshop universe that we don't really see, the civilian part of it. So
absolutely, and that's why I did it. I call it domestic 40k, and I did it because when the Inquisitor game came out, and this is 12 years ago, whatever, and I was just writing Gaunt's Ghost books, they sent me photocopies of the Inquisitor rulebook, all the artwork, because they thought I might find it quite useful just the atmospheric stuff to look at when I'm writing Gorms. And I looked at it and I went, this is great. Can I write a book about these guys? Can I write an Inquisitor book? And they went, do you want to? And I said, yes. And they said, how fast can you write it? Because if you can write it within 3 or 4 months, we can bring it out when the game comes out and it'll look deliberate. So I went, okay then. And so Eisenhorn did come out of that. It was just my sheer enthusiasm for what they showed me. And I picked Eisenhorn almost at random from the list of little character profiles and sort of ran with that and built that up. And it became something that I'm enormously proud of, because, like you said, it's very little of it is set on the front line of the war, which is where the game is set and where most of the fiction is set. It's set in the cities. It's set in the dark. In fact, it's Lovecraftian. Let's face it. It's dark cults and deep conspiracies and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll wrap up about that. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming, and yeah, let's start the signing.
Yes.